Welcome back. Let's take a deep breath in and out. Today's topic is working through disagreements. So whether you're writing an argument paper for a class or even just trying to figure out what to do over the weekend with your friends, you've probably come up against a case of disagreement at least once or twice in the course of your life. In his book, The Philosophy of Rhetoric, I.A. Richards said that rhetoric should be the study of misunderstanding and its remedies, which is to say that rhetoric can provide the kinds of understanding and skills that we need to deal productively with people, even and especially when we disagree with them. So whether you're looking to write a stronger paper or just finalize your weekend plans, here are 7 rhetorical principles to help you deal with disagreement. Longtime fans of the show will know that rhetoric is whatever we do when we're trying to get other people on the same page. The fact is we just aren't on the same page by default as other people. There are probably as many different opinions out there as there are people. And that's just a fact of life, really, more than it is a reason to freak out. Rhetoric has been around for a long time, and at least in the Western world, its roots can be traced back to ancient Greek democracy. Without a king to just tell people what to do and then to force them to fall in line, the ancient Greeks needed to figure out a way to coordinate their democratic society and to get people on the same page so that things could function. In the many years since, rhetoric continues to serve as a way to work productively with people who see the world in different ways. So, in the same way that we don't need to live in fear of melted ice cream because we've invented freezers, we also don't need to worry too much about disagreements because we have the knowledge and skills to deal with them. If you have good rhetorical know-how, you can take disagreements in stride. So why are disagreements such a normal part of everyday life? Well, because people's everyday lives are pretty different. Think about it like this. Imagine you have a friend who really likes a particular restaurant and they want to take you there on Saturday. They tell you it's the best, they say. My family goes there every year on New Year's Day. We have brunch there, they've got amazing food, and if it's your birthday, they'll give you free waffles. Well, you don't really want to go to that restaurant. You've been there before. The last time you went there was the day you got dumped. The day that all that maple and butter turned to ash in your mouth. Your friend is clearly excited about going to that restaurant, but you're just not on board. So notice here that the disagreement has nothing to do with the objective qualities of that restaurant. For your hypothetical friend, it's the same building with the same menu and the same waitstaff and everything that you experienced. The difference is not in the restaurant. The difference is in the quality of your respective experiences of that restaurant. Of course, it would be ineffective and hurtful for your friend to say something like, "Don't be stupid, it's just an objectively great restaurant. All the reviews online are positive, let's just go." For you, it's really not about the reviews or even the food, it's about what happened there. And the same could be said for your hypothetical friend. What your friend is excited about is not so much the restaurant as the good experiences and memories that your friend has had there. So remember that. Disagreements are almost never about the facts. You can't just resolve a disagreement, that is, by throwing facts at your audience because they already know the facts. The problem is that they experience those facts differently. So if you really want to work productively through disagreement, you need to understand how your audience experiences the facts in order to understand where their opinions come from. So you also need to be prepared to respect your audience's experiences. It would be an act of supreme arrogance to write an argument telling your audience that they're wrong and stupid for disagreeing with your perspective. Surely they have good reasons for their opinions. They're based in their experiences of the world. You don't know their experiences better than they do. So start by understanding where your audience is coming from, and then decide how you can get them on the same page while still respecting their experiences. Otherwise, they're just not going to listen. Have you ever spent much time looking at those maps of the United States that show where people use different words? Maybe you're a person who says pop while other people say soda. Or you might know of people who call every carbonated beverage Coke. The point here is that across the country, people have different words for the same thing, but nobody would really call those words the wrong words for that thing. If you're a pop person and somebody asks you for a soda, you wouldn't wrinkle up your nose and say you have no idea what they're talking about. Chocolate cake is the wrong word for a fizzy drink. Soda is just a different word for a fizzy drink. By and large, the kinds of things we disagree about are not matters of absolute right and wrong, even if sometimes we act like it. And that's important because it keeps things in perspective. The people who disagree with you are not evil monsters who cling to falsehoods and manipulate the weak. They're just people who have lived different lives, who have experienced the world differently, and consequently hold different opinions. Now, to say that different opinions are just different is not to say that all opinions are equally good. Some probably are much better than others. And if that weren't the case, we wouldn't try to get people on the same page. We wouldn't need rhetoric. We would just let people do whatever it is they wanted to do. So when I say that different opinions are just different, I don't mean to say that any attempt at persuading other people is a waste of time. What I do mean to say is that it's not your job to exterminate the opposition. It's your job to help people see their experiences in a new and better light. Rhetoric isn't about good guys destroying bad guys. It's about regular people who have differences working together to achieve shared goals. Opposites have a lot of things in common. Hot and cold are opposites because they're both measures of temperature. Hot and empty, though, are not opposites because they don't have enough in common to be compared. Hot is about temperature, and empty is about physical space. A lot of the disagreements we face work the same way. We have a tendency to see people on the other side of an issue as our opposites, which is to say we see them as being so different from us that there's no possible way that we could work things out and come to a solution. But that's not only counterproductive, it's also just wrong. The fact is, if you find yourself on opposite sides of an issue, you actually have a lot more in common than you think. Now, most people who make grilled cheese sandwiches probably butter their bread before toasting the sandwich in the pan. But there are people out there who use mayonnaise, and you might think that the butter and mayonnaise camps are on opposite sides of the issue. But the fact is they have much more significant commonalities than differences. For example, they are both in favor of browned, crispy grilled cheese sandwiches. They use different means to accomplish that goal, but they do have the same goal. So rather than fight about butter versus mayonnaise, they could come together and work productively to talk about the best ways to achieve a browned, crispy crust. Kenneth Burke once said, "Are things disunited in body? Then unite them in spirit." In the grand scheme of grilled cheese, the practical differences of using mayonnaise or butter can be worked through by appealing to a higher commonality, the goal of crispness. Or with another person, you might disagree about a practice, and you might even disagree about your goal, but you can find common ground in shared values. Wherever you can find an opposition, you'll discover that you have much more in common than not, and those similarities can be leveraged to work through a difficult issue. So if you're going to invest in the rhetorical process of working through a disagreement with somebody, you're going to have to be willing to be wrong. Now, of course, you'll go into the situation believing that what you have to say is better. You wouldn't be saying it otherwise. But if you are going to tell your audience that their perspective is limited, you should also recognize that yours is as well. So just as their position is rooted in their experiences, your position is also rooted in yours. Your proposal might be the best possible course of action based on what you understand, but you might not have the whole picture. In fact, you probably don't have the whole picture. The rhetorical process is one of sharing ideas, making arguments, interpreting facts, working towards a shared understanding of a situation in order to determine the best course of action. If you are generally engaged in the process of getting on the same page, and I do mean the same page, not necessarily your page, it's very possible that your position will change over time. If you're writing a paper, for example, and you start with one thesis statement in mind, and then through the process of writing that paper and doing your research, your thesis statement changes, that's a good thing. It's pretty crass to go around acting like you know everything. If you start out with your issue figured out before you even start talking to other people and trying to work through it, then you're probably not going to get very far. It's not a good idea to commit to your position too early. It's smarter instead to leave room for your views to change and adapt as you work through the process over time. Of course, I'm not saying that you need to go into a situation prepared to abandon all of your ideals. There may be things that are very important to you and that you're unwilling to compromise, and there's nothing wrong with that. You should have strong ideals and values. However, it's helpful to be willing to accept the possibility that there are better ways to practice your ideals. Think about our grilled cheese rivals. You don't have to give up your commitment to well-toasted bread, but have you ever considered toasting it in garlic aioli instead of butter? In sum, the point I'm trying to make is that rhetoric is a two-sided process. If you're going to ask people to change their minds and alter their lives, it's fair and appropriate to be willing to make changes as well. Really, it might be more accurate to say that you shouldn't force people to do what you want. One of the things that I really value about rhetoric is that it respects other people's agency, or in other words, their ability to act for themselves. So if you're going to write an effective argument and deal with disagreement productively, you have to give your audience the ability to make their own decisions. Rhetoric isn't about forcing people, it's about persuading them. Imagine then that your next door neighbor has grown some tomatoes and you really want them. It's been forever since you've had a good tomato. Well, you have a few options. You could sneak over during the night and eat them all while your neighbor sleeps, but that's not rhetoric, that's theft. You could knock your neighbor unconscious and eat all the tomatoes, but that's not rhetoric, that's violence. You could spray some dye on the tomatoes and tell your neighbor that they've gone rotten and that you'll take them off her hands, but that's also not rhetoric, that's manipulation. You could gather up some friends and pitchforks and torches and surround your neighbor's house and demand the tomatoes. But that's not rhetoric either, that's intimidation. Or you could go to your neighbor's house, compliment her gardening skills, tell her that you've really wanted some tomatoes for a long time to make tomato sauce, and promise to give her some of the tomato sauce after you've made it. Now your neighbor might say no, but you've given her some pretty good reasons to say yes. That is rhetoric. If you're committed to the rhetorical process, you recognize that things can start to get pretty scary when people resort to violence and coercion to get what they want. If you want to guarantee a particular outcome, the only way to do that is through force, but that requires disrespecting your audience. So if you want to make effective and responsible arguments, you need to be willing to acknowledge that your audience might not end up being persuaded by what you have to say. Of course, you'll do everything you can to persuade them and to help them to see things the way you see them, but you also need to acknowledge that things might not end up going your way. And that's okay, because if we resorted to force, we'd be pretty sure that things could turn pretty ugly pretty quick. Remember, anytime you use force to get your neighbor's tomatoes, she'll resent you. But if you use responsible rhetoric to persuade your neighbor to share her tomatoes, there won't be any hard feelings. When you try to force people to do things, you gain enemies that you then have to destroy in order to get what you want. When you focus on persuasion, though, you build friendships and gain allies who, once you're on the same page, will then work with you to help to improve a situation. Finally, if you're going to work through this entire rhetorical process of dealing with disagreement productively, it's worth acknowledging that a step in the right direction is better than no step at all. Rhetoric works in the real world, not the ideal world, and by that, I mean that we can and should have lofty ideals, but we also need to recognize that we might not be able to implement those ideals right away. In a perfect world, everyone would just agree with us by default, but of course we don't live in a perfect world, at least not in a world that aligns perfectly with the way we think it should be. But that doesn't mean that we're out of luck. Even if we can't get our perfect scenario right away, the rhetorical process is useful for helping us to work towards a better scenario. So let's imagine that you're failing your biology class and you go to your teacher near the end of the semester to ask for a higher grade because you need at least a B to get into your major. Well, in the perfect world, your teacher would just raise your grade. But in the real world, your teacher just can't do that. Simply changing your grade wouldn't be fair to the other students, and it might get your teacher in trouble with the administrators. So instead, your teacher agrees to let you make up assignments and even redo one of the projects for a higher grade. Now you have a couple of options. You could just straight out reject the offer because it's not what you wanted. You could take the failing grade, start tweeting about how stupid your teacher is, you could maybe try to get them fired, you could throw eggs at their car. Or you could accept the offer and recognize that even if your teacher isn't in a position to give you your ideal outcome, your teacher is in a position to help you to achieve a better outcome than you otherwise would have been able to achieve. That's why I think it's so useful to think of rhetoric as a process. Because real life is messy and people come to different issues from different angles, you might not be able to persuade people to get on board with your ideal vision all at once. And that's okay because you really don't have to. You might be able to work together to take a few steps forward, and then as time passes, you might be able to persuade them to take a few more steps forward. As the rhetorical process unfolds over time, the situation can get closer and closer to your ideal vision in a way that serves everyone. An all or nothing approach to disagreement is a pretty quick road to nothing. If neither you nor your audience will budge from your position, no matter how right you think you are, then you're both just stuck. Sure, you could badger and bully them into doing what you want, but again, that's not rhetoric anymore. So if you really are committed to the rhetorical process and to the respect for the other side that process entails, then you'll recognize that a few steps forward now is better than a giant leap that never comes. Disagreement is unavoidable, but with these 7 principles, you'll be in a better position to deal with disagreements effectively. Then, instead of seeing just who can shout their opinion the loudest, you'll be involved in a real process of working with real people towards real improvement. When important things are at stake, it's becoming increasingly popular to see things in stark contrasts between right and wrong, our allies and our enemies. But it's important to recognize that our so-called enemies are people too. And even if we can't respect their ideals, we can and should respect their humanity. I realize that, as with all things rhetorical, someone might take issue with the principles as I've outlined them here. If everyone already agreed to them, I wouldn't need to say them. However, I'll just say that how we do things matters at least as much as what we do, and rhetoric done well offers a way of dealing with disagreements in a way that affirms shared humanity and also promotes collaboration on difficult problems ranging from the personal to the geopolitical. As always, if you have any comments, questions, concerns, or compliments, leave them down below. And if this video was helpful to you, give it a like and share it with a friend or a classmate, and we will look forward to seeing you again soon. Just as their position is rooted in your experiences. Wow, no, it definitely isn't. That's not how this works.